this is Genesis 16:13, and it reads, "She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me." You might have caught a little bit of this in my intro, but and maybe you can now understand why, but the only radio station that was played in my parents' car or in my parents' house was the Christian contemporary radio station by the name of WFRN in South Bend, Indiana. They played all the classic Christian contemporary music. Michael Card gave me a high level of overconfidence in my ability to speak words in Hebrew based off his song El Shaddai. Stephen Curtis Chapman would teach me that there was more to this life. But there was one particular song that caught my 7-year-old attention, and it was a song by For Him called I Want to Be a Man That You Would Write About. Now, to be fair, in 1991, gender-inclusive language around spiritual things was not a thing. But, so I'm gonna read the lyrics, but understand the context. And the song goes, "From the time began, you always chose a man to lead the people safely by your way, to be a voice and echo what you say, like David or Abraham. Your word was full of such men. And if the Bible had no closing page and still was being written to this day, I want to be a man that you would write about, 1,000 years from now, that they could read about, your servant of choice, who found favor, a man who heard your voice." The second verse would go on to say, "Generations away, it's my prayer. They will look back and say, oh, to have that kind of faith and love. What a solid man of God he was." Now, I have to tell you, I was enthralled by this idea, okay? In Berrien Springs in the 1990s, we sang, "Lift up the trumpet and loud let it ring. Jesus is coming again," so often, so urgently, that at the age of 5 years old, I got on my knees and prayed to God, please give me enough time to get a driver's license. It felt like he was coming at any minute. I was literally taking my 7-year-old hand and measuring to see if any cloud was about that size. The idea that we had more time, the idea was shocking and exciting. And not even that we had more time, but that even though I missed the first round pick of the Old Testament and the second round pick of the New Testament, that there could be a third round pick of Bible character draft where my life would be so important to the gospel that I would be noted like an Esther, like us Abigail, and that was thrilling. Instead of the pressure of just being perfect until Jesus came, I thought about a life with meaning, with redemption that was important and valuable for generations to come. Clearly, I was a dramatic child. But you know, I think this new lease on life turned into what was honestly, literally and figuratively, a very performative time in my Christian walk. Now, I am not trained nor licensed to make such declarations, but in retrospect, I think that my behavior carried on in such a way from Genesis to Revelations that one might say I was exhibiting symptoms of a lesser known issue called dissociative Bible personality disorder. Let me explain. When I felt like I had to speak truth to power, I acted like I was Esther. If I felt very unfairly persecuted, I acted as if I was Job. And that was like, middle school through high school. I mean, all of those years. Those were my Job years. When I was the enthusiastic optimist in the face of the majority of pessimists, I felt like I was Caleb, saying, we can take it, we can go, God is with us. And then, even before I had a house, and I just wanted to tell people where I was drawing the line in the sand, I would say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, okay? I would lose my cool often But I never cut off anyone's ear like Peter, so I felt quite justified and proud of myself. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with wanting to emulate people of faith in the Bible. There's many great lessons. But what I've come to realize is that I was so focused on being the center of my story and not looking at how God was working out miracles in my life, that he was not the main character in my story. And unlike Paul, who made his transition to manhood and put childish things away, I kept up these Bible charades well past what the General Conference would deem the age of a young adult. Now, we talked about it a little bit before, this accidental megachurch that I started. But I know that it was part of an experience that led me to what I call my digital Damascus road, okay? One, we at the time we did it a lot more, but every Friday night we would have Vespers, live Vespers, and I know there's an overabundance of online Christian content, but at the time there wasn't anything. And Claudia Marin Allen, she's preached here before. I've known her for a lot of her life. She's younger than I am. She preached a sermon about Hagar that shook me to my core, that I still refer to and think about to this day, and it's almost been 5 years. Now, I am not a literary anointed expert in the way that Claudia is. I'm not going to surmise her sermon. I'm also, based on the Sabbath school lesson that we were learning with Todd, not a theologian, because he kept saying exegesis, eisegesis, and I'm pretty sure the last 5 letters of that word are not actually Jesus as I think of Jesus. So please hear my perspective as more of a testimony than a declarative word for you to apply. But thinking about Hagar, and because I am not a theologian or a literary expert, I really see the story of Hagar and her mistress, Sarai, as what myself as a pseudo-modern biblical anthropologist might call the Real Housewives of Canaan, okay? Now, you have to understand, Hagar, and why Hagar's story is so powerful is because she's the slave, literal and figurative slave of Sarai. Sarai, if we were going to use this analogy of the Real Housewives of Canaan, is the woman in the center of the opening episode, holding open the scroll, full frontal, in full view as a center character, with maybe Lot's wife off to the side, but in the pan, right? So she is wealthy by virtue of her husband. She is, we would come to find, to be the mother of many generations leading to the Savior. She's also so outrageously beautiful that her husband tells her to say she's his sister so that he won't get killed by powerful men. Like, that's who Sarah is. Now, I even imagine that the Canaan equivalent of TMZ brings their camels and donkeys around to draw pictures of Sarai on papyrus paper and distribute that to the commoners. That's the kind of life Sarai had, okay? But what's fascinating to me is that the Bible does not record a single interaction with Sarai, this powerful woman in her context, that's directly with an angel from the Lord. However, Hagar, the slave, has this experience. And even if she, without that experience, she also never gets the opportunity to give God a name in the way that Hagar gets to give God a name, and that it is recorded in the scriptures. Let's just go back for a second, back into Genesis 16, and listen to the story where Hagar meets the angel. Now, the background is Sarai, has all the things, but she doesn't have a baby. So her bright idea, and maybe it's not her bright idea, it's just the first we come across it that I can see in the Bible, is take the slave, you have a baby with her, Abram, then I will have a family, and I can add to my storyline on these Real Housewives of Canaan, right? And then they agree. They all, let's assume someone who's a slave does not have the right to agree, but it happens that Abraham takes Hagar as a wife for only one verse, because then they continue to refer to her as the slave, and she gets pregnant. And once she gets pregnant, Sarai, who has chosen this path, feels like Hagar is angry with her. Now, I've always heard it in the sermons that and often by men, that it's almost like Hagar thinks she's better than Sarai because she is now pregnant and Sarai is not able to bear a child yet. But, I've been pregnant now a few times. And the reality is you're really angry with everybody responsible for the situation. And in this situation, Sarai is responsible for the discomfort, for the feet. There's no record that Hagar is now living in luxury and relaxing. She's still the slave on top of being pregnant. So I just want to counter that previous rhetoric that I've always heard, that Hagar was now thinking she had made it and was probably just acting like a reasonable pregnant woman, okay? So, amen? Okay. With that said, let's go back to the chapter. She's now, Hagar, pregnant, an Egyptian in Canaan, in a foreign land, has decided to run away. That's to have been the most vulnerable person in her context, and to still have chosen the wild over where she was. I'll just let you think on that. Back in verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that was beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? You just said, my owner. I don't understand why you're asking me where I came from. And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants, so much so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. His name shall be Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name, and this is the text of emphasis, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, she said. I have now been seen by the one who sees me. Now, Claudia, being the brilliant mind that she is, parallels this example of a slave woman, an African slave woman at that, having an encounter with an angel in her despair, in her moment of oppression and distress, and giving name to a God that speaks to God understanding and seeing what seems to be having been forgotten. And Claudia, truly and wisely and more beautifully than I could ever do, expressed how this was a name not often used in the more general Christian context. It wasn't a big part of, it's always Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Nisi, like it's all these other words that came out of the Israelite experience. And they needed to be hidden. But in the moments of oppression, knowing that there's a God that sees us, that is critically important. And, and I just want to break down a few things that, as I've constantly thought about this message and this idea, that really stood out to me about what these encounters with God look like. One, God comes to where you are. In a couple chapters later on, when she I think it's chapter 19, after Israel is born, Isaac is born. Sarai no longer has a need for Hagar and her son. So she's like, send them away. I don't want them here anymore. I now have what I want. And so Hagar now, not necessarily of her own choice, is now left to fend for herself again in the wild. And again, in these moments of isolation, the angel returns to her and spares her life and gives her that hope again. So there's a repeated theme, at least with Hagar. And if you look at other Bible characters, that you can see how God appears. And so these are the three things I took away from that. One, God comes to you where you are, all right? God gives relevant and timely instruction. You are pregnant. You will go back. But lastly, God gives a hope and a future. And therefore, the promise was given to her at that time. You know, the more I thought about the story of Hagar, the more I actually thought, maybe, sure, it could be a expression that is more tied to a particular experience, that of being marginalized, that could be the name that I give God or use for God. But I really thought maybe it's more simplistic than that. Maybe it is that we each have an opportunity, based on our experiences with God, to give him a name that speaks to exactly how he showed up in our lives. So, almost exactly 3 years ago, I was back here preaching at Advent Hope, and I'm sorry that this is here because there's been so many other advancements, and if I could figure out how to use the teleprompter, we wouldn't have the pulpit, which is, I guess, a thing of the pre-pandemic past. But I preached here, and then, you know, a casual 2 weeks later, the world shut down. And God willing, this will not happen again. And you know, quite frankly, I'm a homebody. I live in Jersey. I didn't have to commute anymore. I didn't have to take these kids, get them up, get them dressed, just from the waist up. Some of these things of coronavirus, virtual living, were not that hard for me at first. And I, quite frankly, also stopped watching the news during the last administration. So, you know, a lot of what was happening was not sitting with me all day long in a way that was too uncomfortable to bear, although it was a very grave and serious time. And, you know, my husband went to Trader Joe's, and he finally was like, there's nothing here. We have to sojourn to Maryland to be with my sister-in-law. And even that was better. She has a beautiful house, and my kids could run around because one of the things, and maybe it's more common for everyone in New York, we were on the top floor, there's people on the bottom floor, no one's going outside, everyone hates each other because your kids are running on top of their kids, no one's sleeping. So we just left, okay? And probably about a month into our time in Maryland, my 1-year-old, who was the only child I wasn't worried about. I had the 3-year-old in virtual school acting like she was paying attention to Zoom, she was not. I had the 2nd grader who was trying to learn multiplication. It was very stressful. And the 1-year-old, you know, she just kind of took care of herself. Until one weird day, my sister-in-law, God bless her, is a doctor. And, you know, Joelle had been acting a little different and wasn't able to swallow food. So she looked down in her throat, and there was something back there, pardon me, that she thought was suspicious. Now, I have not seen a human that doesn't have my last name now in like 4 months, okay? We've been in the house. And even when we came to Maryland, we were like in the car, no bathroom stops, like all the way down. So I call my doctor in New Jersey, and I'm trying to do this virtual visit, and he's like, I think you have to go to urgent care, just so they can look at her. And I was like, humans outside? What do you mean? So we go to the urgent care, and the woman is asking me all sorts of like really disturbing, concerning questions. And ultimately, and then she started like opening the door like this much and asking questions and be like, okay, I'll be right back. And then back and forth, back and forth. And I'm like, this is really strange. Now, granted, it's my first human interaction during a pandemic. I don't know what's normal anymore. And she says, I'm not going to call an ambulance, but I want you to go directly to the children's hospital right now. Your daughter needs to be admitted. And I was like, outside? Like another place with more sick people? Long story short, we get to the hospital, they admit her, we're like almost in a bubble room. They are concerned that my child has, and I only knew who Fauci was because of the condition that we were in, but they brought in this man who could have been the attending to Fauci when he was a resident or intern, who was like the foremost infectious disease doctor in pediatric health in America. And he was completely flabbergasted by what was going on. And that's when I got scared. I was like, when Fauci's boss cannot figure out what's happening with your 1-year-olds, you're in trouble. So we spent a month at that hospital. And I hope no one went through this personally, but there was, at least with children, you could be one parent or one adult at a time. There was a lot of people who were sick as adults who were by themselves because of all of the limitations with people and the coronavirus. But what that meant was, in order for my husband to come up, I had to put my daughter in the little, crib cage and run down 3 halls, wait for the slowest elevator ever, run down to the lobby where we would just like high five, handoff. He would run back so that he could spend some time with her. I had never felt more alone in my life and helpless. And she's just looking at me like, what are you gonna do? She can't talk, I can't figure it out. And these foremost doctors are like a little hopeless or clueless. And but the truth is this, the story is not about my daughter, who fortunately is still alive. We're still figuring out what it could be, what the long-term realities are gonna be for her. She's growing, so we're praising God for that. But I will tell you that during a time that was so gut-wrenching, I think I had what's closest to my own Hagar experience. So when I was alone, God sent angels in the forms of friends from New Jersey. The church sent us Uber Eats cards so that my kids could eat, because I forgot about the other 2. There's a mom's Christian fellowship that meets here. I would join now because I was by myself and over Zoom, and they saw me completely covered up with like thousands of blankets and sweatshirts, and because it's freezing cold in the hospital even though it was summertime. And they sent me this blanket that I felt like Joseph when he got the, I felt the love. God also sent, after a month in the hospital, and even though she was developing more symptoms and issues, the hospital in DC said, you know what, we cannot figure it out. You need to take her home and hopefully connect with specialists. And I was so besides myself. And I had a friend, because everyone's like, oh, I can help, I can do this, I can do that. And I had this woman that I didn't know so well, and she's like, Saba, you can't give up. Can you just send me like a little blurb about what's going on with your daughter? And it was probably like my last ounce of energy. I sent her this little note, literally like 4 lines. She's has no neutrophils, she's on a feeding tube, not eating, we don't understand, all these different things. It's fortunately not, leukemia, but some other failure. And she said, give me some time. So I'm pretty much just taking my daughter home and gonna leave it in God's hands. So maybe about 2 hours later, this is a Friday, and if you've ever been in a hospital, you're working in a hospital, you know that unless something really awful and emergent is happening to you, there's nothing happening on the weekends, okay? Don't go to a hospital on the weekend, just wait till Monday. There's nothing happening there, unless it's extremely urgent. And so I get an email Friday night from my friend forwarded to me. He says, you're gonna get a call tomorrow morning, Saturday morning. I'm like, huh. Go back to read the note. There's my note, the note above it, it says, "Dear Mom, this is my friend's baby. I would never want this to happen to my kids. She really needs help." Next email I see go up says, "See below." The next email above that says, "Our chief scientific officer will call her tomorrow. I hope we can help." And it was signed the CEO of the most decorated, best children's hospital in the world. And sure enough, the next morning, I got a phone call from a man who was not even, it was Sabbath, and we know what that means, but he was actually on a sabbatical, and he took time and spent 2 hours talking through, painfully listening about our whole process, and I told him that they're sending us home, and we've been calling around the country, and the specialist that she needs to see, because there's about 4 or 5 of them, are saying, maybe 5 months till you can get an appointment. And I'm thinking, I don't know if she's gonna last that long. He said, "Can you come to Boston in 2 weeks? I'll set everything up for her to see everybody." I think I'm still living off of the boost of that moment. And I want to be clear, we went there and it was a fantastic experience. Every specialist that we saw her in person. That had been another hindrance of the pandemic, people seeing them over Zoom, and I'm like, what did you see over Zoom? But we went there, and to me, that whole experience was my friend, the one who said, "I want to help you," showed me a true, real model of what it looks like to take our problems to Jesus. Jesus takes them to the Father. In this case, she took it to the mother. The mother took it directly to the source to get the problem done. And it changed things. I could have maybe emailed the woman if I thought that way, but it was because of the relationship. It's because of the Son. It's because of the Father and their access that supplies our needs in very real and direct ways. And, that whole experience, and I'm sure for every person in this room, there's many testimonies of a very hard time, and we were very blessed. We are here. There's a lot of people whose testimony that is not true for. So I have nothing to complain about. But I will tell you, the name that emerged for me when I thought about how untethered I was, how disconnected I felt, and how God showed up for me, the name that, if you see my Bible, it says Saba, connect to Jehovah Wi-Fi. And it's funny, but it really, to me, and it may be refined, because I was like, well, now I'm leaving the house. Should it be Jehovah Cellular? Because I want this to go with me everywhere. But the sense that I have that God at all times keeps me powered, filled, without any sense of how that's even happening. You see no infrastructure for how God is doing it, other than that it's God doing it. Now, I am not saying that you should now adopt my name and that's who God is. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm praying is your potential takeaway is that you go back into your life. And it took me years, even after kind of even having this idea, born out of a story of a slave woman named Hagar, to kind of come to my own crystallizing or beginning to crystallize of who God is to me. My charge is for you to go into your life, into your journey, and to center God and in the work that he's doing and the name that speaks to how he's shown up in your life. And if you preach about it, preach about it. But if you don't preach about it, let it guide you as your own special connection to God, because I believe if he could be there for Hagar, if he can show up for me, he will do that for everyone. So thank you very much and have a happy Sabbath.